Let's start with the resumption of arms supplies to Ukraine. Podolyak notes that the US can't afford the reputational damage from halting support. How does suspending and then resuming aid affect America's reputation? No, it doesn't. This is not about the United States in general, but about Donald Trump. Today, many people associate U.S. foreign policy directly with him. In this period, during his second presidential campaign, Trump personifies the United States. His positioning determines the perception of the country in the international arena. This is my personal opinion, and it applies to the Trump team, not the entire country. There is a serious debate within his inner circle about what foreign policy should be, particularly in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The decisions of Colby or Hackett have caused different reactions even among Trump's associates. The same is true in Europe and Ukraine. This means that it is Trump's personal position that determines whether aid to Ukraine will come. After the Oval Office scandal in March, the supply of weapons, including intelligence, was suspended. Although it is only a suspension of certain items, this is a serious blow to Ukraine. Yesterday, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had a telephone conversation with Trump, during which she assured him that there was no complete cessation. We continued to receive intelligence during Russia's air attacks, when kamikaze drones or missiles were launched, and this was important. However, even a partial suspension of arms supplies, like Biden's decision not to transfer ATACMS to Ukraine, has a negative impact on our defense capabilities. I believe that the perception of the United States largely depends on who is in charge of the White House at a particular historical moment. This has always been the case, even during World War II. At the same time, there are strategic principles of U.S. foreign policy that determine its direction for the entire period of the state's existence. They have been operating for many years, regardless of who holds the presidency, and have been achieving common goals. In this story, Ukraine is not a strategic goal for the United States, but rather one of the episodes on the way to achieving another strategic goal: confrontation with China and global leadership. This leadership is viewed as positive, as American democracy demonstrates an effective model of concern for global stability. There is currently no alternative, as the role of global arbiter requires significant financial and human resources. The initiatives promoted by Trump also fit into the U.S. foreign policy paradigm, albeit in a specific way that is not always consistent with the declared strategic goals, but does not deny them. The United States traditionally considers China to be the main threat. Trump does not deviate from the general U.S. foreign policy line, but tries to implement it through his own approaches, in particular by trying to separate Russia from China and force Europe to rethink its international relations. In terms of confronting Russia, his methods have not yet yielded tangible results. In fact, there is no result at all. Therefore, the situation with the suspension of arms supplies to Ukraine is not about U.S. policy in general. Many Republicans opposed Trump's approach. This was clearly evident during the Senate vote on the bill initiated by Trump, which was signed into law yesterday. Although only 3 Republicans voted against it, it was enough to jeopardize the bill's passage. Only J.D. Vance's intervention saved the day. Speaking of the House of Representatives and Congress in general, the representative branch of the U.S. government is acting more pragmatically and logically in response to external threats than Trump himself.
в Сполучених Штатах Америки, він більш є, ну скажу так, прагматичніший і логічніший у своїх діях стосовно тих зовнішніх загроз, аніж дії Трампа.
Trump is likely to remain president until 2029, and the world will have to live through this period. He will not last forever, and everyone understands this. Similar comments have already been made, including by the president of Ukraine, who emphasized that Trump will not be in power forever, and that another leader will emerge. The problem is that Ukraine does not have much time. At the same time, Putin's intransigence may play in Ukraine's favor, forcing Trump to partially change his position. I don't expect global changes, but there may be new opportunities to get air defense systems, including missiles for the Patriot, or other assistance. However, we should not hope for large-scale arms supplies, as Trump promised if Putin refuses to stop his aggression.
Системи протиповітряної оборони, зокрема ракети до Петріот, можливо, ще щось, але якогось такого суттєвого там очікувати рішення про глобальні поставки зброї до України, як то Трамп обіцяв, як тільки Путін не погодиться, я дам Україні закидати зброю, ну цього не варто очікувати.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, according to Politico, said that China cannot allow Russia to lose because it is not in its interests. This is the first such statement, probably addressed to a European audience. In the context of the strategic objectives of the United States, as discussed earlier, this position of China is important, especially given the policies pursued by Trump. The alleged suspension of aid to Ukraine could be an attempt to negotiate with Putin, after which Trump expressed his disappointment and renewed his support. However, for the United States, a situation where China openly declares its intransigence is a serious challenge in the global confrontation. Miss Albina, you yourself noted that there was no direct speech. Yesterday in the studio of Channel 24, we also discussed this issue, and I drew attention to the same point. There was no specific statement. The official position of the Chinese Foreign Ministry was not voiced in the form of direct support for Russia or a statement that it should not lose. This is just a paraphrase of the words that Kaja Kallas gave to journalists after a meeting with Wang Yi. According to diplomatic protocol, such a meeting is quite logical, as Kallas is the vice president of the European Commission for Foreign Affairs. Her words indicate that such a conversation could indeed have taken place. The question is, why was it leaked to the media? Perhaps someone in Europe is trying to get China to put pressure on Russia. But such an idea looks completely unrealistic. If any politician really believes that such statements can influence Beijing, they are naive and short-sighted.
Навіть коли політики якогось там високого рівня думають, що вони це можуть, заявивши, розцінювати це як реальність, це знову виглядає дуже по-дитячому.
For China, the current situation is ideal. Russia is dragging out the war, and China is getting cheap resources amid its own economic crisis. It does not need anything else. This became apparent during Joe Biden's presidency, especially in 2023, when illusions about the possibility of involving China in the process of ending hostilities disappeared. Today, it is hard to imagine that China is really interested in ending the war. On the contrary, it will support it, and this is clear to everyone. I have no doubt about it. The fact that this position has become public has surprised some Ukrainian experts, but in fact, nothing extraordinary has happened. China has consistently defended its interests in Russia, using its economic weakness to expand its influence. It is gradually intensifying its economic expansion, and Russia's war against Ukraine is beneficial to it from all sides.
Збільшуючи економічну експансію через її економічне послаблення, потроху він з'їдає цю велику гору, оцього слона Китай, і війна Росії проти України йому вигідна в усіх сенсах.
Why would anyone think that China should not influence Putin? Recently, Israel called on China to influence Iran to stop it from attacking Israel. This seems naive. Perhaps such statements are needed as a formality to demonstrate that there have been appeals and diplomatic steps. But everyone understands that the strategic goals of Xi Jinping and his team are much broader, although not without internal contradictions. My colleagues and I discussed this during the program. China's main goal is to increase its influence on the European continent. This does not mean that it is ready to act immediately. For now, China is focused on the Indo-Pacific region, in particular on supporting North Korea. It is hard to imagine Russia and North Korea building relations without Beijing's consent. China's tacit support is obvious. The growing independence of the DPRK in the international arena is also the result of Beijing's policy. It is not entirely correct to say that China has announced something new and that it can significantly change the situation. In fact, this is not the case. China will continue to act consistently in pursuit of its strategic goals, in particular in the direction of expanding Russia's eastern region. It is no coincidence that there is information about China's intelligence activities in the Arctic, as well as its interest in Russian territories, albeit not in a direct way. The FSB's report on this is also not accidental. China will not put pressure on Russia to end the war. On the contrary, it will support it. Given the strategic objectives of the United States, the question arises, what is Trump's goal in this war? It seems that the United States is interested in Ukraine's victory, but its actions do not yet confirm this. Frankly speaking, what exactly is the Trump administration's goal in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war?
Зрозуміти, яка задача Трампа в цій війні, в російсько-українській війні. Нібито зрозуміло, що Сполучених Штатів є інтерес, аби Україна в цій війні вистояла, перемогла, але дії поки що на це не вказують. Як ви бачите тоді, от якщо відверто говорити, Трампівська адміністрація, яке перед собою ставить завдання в російсько-українській війні?
Just stop shooting. Stop, do not fire. And continue to develop economic relations with Russia and other countries. This opens up new opportunities, but this strategy is wrong. Trump believes that by strengthening Russia, he can pull it away from China. There is some logic in this because a weakened Russia becomes more vulnerable to Chinese influence. We can agree with this, but there is another threat, the expansion of Russia's subversive or even conventional special operations against NATO countries. Putin's regime is not about peaceful trade after the ceasefire. Even Trump has recognized this. His current goals are to stop the fighting between Russia and Ukraine, to end Israel's conflicts with Hamas, Iran, and Lebanon, and to stabilize the situation in the Persian Gulf, including deterring the Yemeni Houthis.
Поки що він ставить перед собою такі цілі: припинити стріляти Росія проти України, припинити стріляти Ізраїль проти Хамас, Ізраїль проти Ірану, проти Лівану, десь, можливо, там усмирити єменських хуситів, щоб вони не чіпали Перський регіон, було там спокійно, плюс-мінус.
After that, they quickly set up trade, make a lot of money, and then claim, "Look how effective I am. We have made America great again." This strategy is wrong, because it is almost impossible to achieve such goals in the 4 years of Trump's term. It is an extremely difficult task. All previous presidents have gradually moved in this direction, trying to stabilize the Middle East, contain the threat of war in Europe, and respond to the constant challenges from China over Taiwan, North Korea over South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Australia. These problems existed before, but Trump is looking for a quick effect. To come, to demonstrate results, to be recognized. He has already claimed to have ended 4 wars, and then even a flood. This approach may be beneficial for him personally, but it will have serious consequences for the United States. Americans will have to recover from such decisions for a long time. The period of Trump's presidency. I'm not a strategist, but if you look at the situation from the outside, the simplest solution seems to be to weaken Russia as much as possible through sanctions pressure and providing Ukraine with as many weapons as possible to deplete Russian resources. In this case, if China wants to keep Russia as a partner, it will have to invest more and more resources in it. This, in my opinion, is the easiest and most logical way. Do you think it is worth weakening Russia rather than strengthening it? What are the advantages and risks of doing so?
Як на мене, це, як я вже сказала, такий найпростіший шлях. скажіть, будь ласка, от як ви бачите, ось, скажімо так, не посилювати Росію, а послаблювати її? В чому тут можуть бути плюси і ризики?
Thank you, Ms. Albina. Indeed, when we talk about whether to weaken or strengthen Russia, there is a cognitive dissonance. Personally, I believe, and I know that there are many like-minded people in Ukraine, that the key is regime change in Russia. We are talking about transforming, fragmenting, and renewing this state so that it can become stronger in its confrontation with China. But for this to happen, completely different people must come to power, not the conventional good Russians, not Navalny, not Khodorkovsky, not Kara-Murza, not Yashin, who remain imperialists by nature. We need new faces, other processes, and a different vision. If we start this process and make it last, it will significantly reduce China's ability to increase its influence on Russia. After all, it is not about partnership, but about the gradual expansion we have just mentioned.
Зменшить можливості тоді Китаю нарощувати свою співпрацю з метою, як ви щойно відзначили, не побудови навіть партнерства з Росією, а й експансії, як я говорив.
Enter as much as you want sounds logical, yet we also hear, I threatened him with sanctions, but he doesn't care. The White House ignored Ukraine's proposals on international platforms, both under Biden and Trump. Trump openly calls Putin a professional who bypasses sanctions, and even admires him. Recently, he admitted Putin isn't ready to end the war, or sees no way forward. In this context, U.S. calls for new sanctions on Russia seem hard to grasp. The U.S. first will not impose new sanctions, and second, Russia has at some point become indifferent to them, as Europe continues to buy oil, and China even more so. The U.S. sanctions are not actually having any effect. This must be recognized. It would be much more effective if European countries decided to stop buying energy from Russia. Instead, we see statements by Merkel lobbying for the interests of German companies in Slovakia, claiming that Slovaks need Russian gas. In the first half of 2025, Europe will even increase imports of Russian liquefied natural gas. This is the reality. Therefore, it is logical not just to weaken Russia, but to change it. After all, a weakened Russia opens the way for China to establish full control there, to form a loyal government that will follow all Beijing's instructions, including participation in wars. We should not allow provocations in Northern Europe, but it's hard for me to understand why the obvious things are being ignored. I may not know everything, but that's how I see the situation. This could and should have been done. Moreover, there are those who are ready to take responsibility for the government in Russia. I am not talking about the so-called good Russians, but about the Freedom of Russia Legion, people who have taken up arms and fought against the Putin regime since the first day of the war. This is the way to act. There is no other way. They are capable of controlling nuclear weapons, cooperating with the West, selling resources to Europe without focusing on China. This is the only realistic option. But for some reason, the West still believes that Russia cannot be touched, that it must remain united and inviolable. General Gurolof, who had been banned from Russian propaganda broadcasts for some time, reappeared on YouTube and said that no matter how many Europeans mind their borders, Russia will still attack them with direct war. Although Slovakia shares borders with neither Russia nor Belarus, he is talking about a threat to Poland. The Slovak Prime Minister recently blocked the 18th package of sanctions against Russia. The question arises whether Europe realizes that by buying Russian energy resources, it is actually financing the aggressor. Perhaps some countries realize this, but the actions of politicians like Fico suggest otherwise. As a result, we may be left with energy resources, but no security when Russia moves to open confrontation. It is already preparing the ground for this, both in public statements and in indirect signals. Is Europe paralyzed by figures like Orban and Fico? Partly yes. What to do about it is a difficult question. As for the 18th package of sanctions, economists have different opinions. In combination with American sanctions, it could deal a serious blow to the Russian economy. But by itself, it is just another step that is unlikely to change the situation radically.
На вашу думку, зараз, якщо чи Європа паралізована такими персонажами, як Орбан і Фіцо, що з цим робити? І 18-й пакет санкцій проти Росії, от наскільки він може бути дієвим з огляду на ті позиції, які там є? Тому що зараз думки різняться у економістів, що він разом з американськими санкціями міг би дати серйозний удар по російській економіці, а сам по собі, ну, це буде там черговий 18-й, 19-й, 12-й пакет.
The situation is as follows. If you look at the trade volumes between Russia and Europe, as well as individual countries, they remain significant. In the energy sector alone, last year's volumes reached 20 billion euros. The Baltic states, Poland, Finland, Sweden, and Slovakia, without exception, continue to trade with Russia. Even the United States buys fuel for nuclear power plants. The problem persists. After the end of the Cold War, when both Europe and the United States began to actively restore relations with Russia, this became apparent. The history of gas dependence in Germany and Europe as a whole dates back to the early 2000s. Every year, this dependence only grew, and Russia took advantage of it. A similar model is used today by China, which does not agree to all energy projects, including gas supplies and the construction of new transportation routes.
Свій початок там, мабуть, на початку 2000-х років. І з кожним роком все більше і була ця залежність. І це призвело до того, що Росія скористалася цим самим. От як робить сьогодні Китай, до прикладу? Якщо ми подивимося на цю всю історію, Китай не піддається на всі проекти з енергопостачання, зокрема газу, побудова там додаткових транспортних магістралей по газу і так далі.
China is trying to diversify its sources of supply so as not to be completely dependent on Russia, as it realizes that foreign policy cannot be based on unilateral dependence. In contrast, in Europe, under the government of Angela Merkel, dependence on Russia was increased, which deliberately harmed the future security of the European continent. They must be held accountable for this. It is good that sober voices are now being heard in Europe, declaring that the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines should not be restored, and that purchases of Russian energy resources should be stopped. Although there are doubts about the latter, as American intermediary companies close to the White House are already preparing projects to purchase Russian energy resources and resell them to Europe through themselves. This allows them to make money, and they are even considering the possibility of resuming Nord Stream 2. As for Slovakia, it's not about the whole country, but about the actions of Fico, who acts not in the interests of the state but to preserve his own power. If we think that the leaders of even the most developed countries are guided by the welfare of their citizens, we are deeply mistaken. First of all, everyone in power thinks about how to maintain their position. This applies to Orban, Fico, and many others. In all countries, without exception, politicians are primarily concerned about their own political survival, especially on the eve of elections. We cannot talk about fair elections in Hungary or fair referendums on Ukraine's European integration aspirations. I doubt that there is a real democracy there. It would be right if Orban was removed from power, as this would change Hungary's political course. The same goes for Fico. If he is removed, Slovakia's policy will change. Slovakia's dependence on Russian gas and oil is not a new problem. It has been going on for years. No wonder I mentioned Merkel, who explicitly stated that an exception should be made for Slovakia.
Це історія давня. Я не випадково згадав Мерца, який відверто говорить, нам же треба зробити виняток.
The prospects for the 18th package of sanctions look vague. Like the 17th, it is unlikely to have any real impact. It is unfortunate that there are those in Ukraine who sincerely believe in the power of these decisions and call them powerful blows to Russia. In fact, this is not true. While the sanctions are supposedly in effect, civilians are dying in Ukraine, and Europe continues to actively trade with Russia. And when we talk about this again from Kyiv, it is important to emphasize the real state of affairs. I appreciate the assistance provided by Germany, and it is worth recognizing that under Olaf Scholz, there was more of it than under Merz, despite all the difficulties. Merz was somewhat sympathetic with his statements, but now we are hearing promises of Taurus deliveries that may come in 6 months. It's good that joint ventures are being established, but this is not enough in a time of war.
Мерц своїми бравадами викликав у нас якусь певну там симпатію до себе, але зараз ми ж чуємо, що Тауруси будуть колись через півроку, поки ми навчимо та й взагалі подивимося. Добре, що відкриваємо спільні підприємства.
I cannot say that Europeans do not help. They do, but not to the extent that it is really needed. They act solely from the standpoint of their own national interest, in particular through the prism of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The threat to them is obvious. While we are at war, they are trading, strengthening their own defense, and waiting for the situation with Putin to somehow change. It's strange to hear European politicians expressing concern over the cessation of arms supplies to Ukraine. Didn't they know that this aid would stop after Trump came to office? We knew it. It was obvious that Trump would not supply weapons, despite all his promises. I argued with my colleagues more than once when I said it's not going to happen, and I was told that Trump would restore order. Look at the attitude towards him now. What else needs to happen for him to give Ukraine Patriot systems when children are dying in the country? He expresses regret but does not make decisions. All actions are in the interests of specific states, but not in the interests of Ukraine. That's why we need to act in the same way, cynically and pragmatically. Because this is the world, it will not be otherwise. And the fact that Fico is supposedly concerned is not worth believing. He doesn't care how many children, civilians and soldiers have died in Ukraine.
Повірте, абсолютно не заклонеться. Йому глибоко начхати, скільки в Україні загинуло дітей і цивільних, і військових в тому числі.
It is very difficult for us to act pragmatically and coolly when our relatives, friends and children die. It is impossible to perceive this without emotion. When people say that Europeans are waiting for Putin to disappear, it is worth remembering that even if Putin leaves, the FSB structure will remain. The system of governance in Russia will not change. This system needs to be destroyed from within. You have correctly noted that it is not about governments, but about people, voters who can influence the situation. Every day I make a call. People, you can change the course of events. Europeans, citizens of democratic countries, you are the ones who can prevent the war from coming to your homes, to prevent Russia from bringing this plague to you. In this context, I would like to ask, if Fico and Orban are trying to retain power, this is understandable. But what is Witkoff's motivation when he calls for the lifting of energy sanctions against Russia? What exactly is he trying to preserve?
Хочу запитати з приводу, ви говорите там, Фіцо хоче зберегти свою посаду, Орбан хоче зберегти свою посаду, це зрозуміло. Що Вітков хоче зберегти тим, що він зараз закликає прибрати енергетичні санкції з Росії?
This is about the contradictions within Trump's team, where some are in favor of sanctions and others are in favor of agreements with Russia. But even those who support sanctions are often insincere, as they change their position to the point where their initiatives lose their meaning. For example, Lindsey Graham's initiative initially envisioned a 500% duty on countries that trade energy with Russia. But the entire European continent continues to buy Russian gas and oil, sometimes even smuggled, including sanctioned oil. To be consistent, sanctions should apply to them as well. However, Graham says that these countries are helping Ukraine, so they will not be sanctioned. This is double standards. This is where pragmatism comes in. Then there is another proposal, not to oblige Trump to impose sanctions in the form of duties, but to give him the right to decide on his own. But he has Witkoff and Kellof in his team, who have their own vision and influence decision-making.
Є і інша позиція. Продовжуючи тему із законопроектом Лінсі Грема. Давайте взагалі Трампа не зобов'яжемо засовувати такі санкції у вигляді мит, а дамо йому право, а він вже сам вирішить. Але у Трампа в команді є Вітков і є Келлов.
Witkoff on Trump's team is in fact the equivalent of Sullivan in the Joe Biden administration. Kellof probably plays a role similar to the former State Department chief. It seems that their position is pro-Ukrainian, but not fully sincere, as they are constantly looking back at Trump, what he will say, how he will react. Trump is not about strategic problem-solving, but about an oligarchic approach, where the main thing is to negotiate, trade, and make money. He does not think in terms of 10 or 20 years ahead. For example, the passage of a law that increases the U.S. national debt by $3.4 trillion over the next decade does not bother him, because it will not happen during his term. It is the same with sanctions against Russia. Decisions are gradually being made that ease the pressure. Hungary has already received permission to expand cooperation with Russia to complete nuclear facilities. In fact, sanctions against Rosatom have been lifted, and this has already happened under Trump.
Потроху, але потроху згадана Угорщина, вона ж отримала сьогодні можливість розширення співпраці із Росією для добудови атомних об'єктів на своїй території. Фактично проти Росатому зняли санкції. І це вже зроблено при Трампі.
Trump does not support sanctions. He said that they harm the economic stability of Russia, which he believes needs to be strong to be able to detach from China. In response, China is actually saying, keep fighting with Europe. It is difficult to find consistency in this logic. The only realistic way out is to launch internal processes in Russia itself. There is no military solution to Russia's war against Ukraine. Many experts recognize this. We tried to act from within. The Freedom of Russia Legion conducted operations even in Belarus, but the West made it clear, this cannot be done. The Kursk region is a different story, not related to the Legion, where Russians themselves tried to establish an alternative government. They could have launched processes like the Belarusian or Kursk People's Republic, but the West again said no. Putin is allowed, but others are not. This is a double standard. That's why when we hear Steve Witkoff's statements about lifting sanctions against Russia, it looks like a logical continuation of the same policy. If Putin is allowed, then why not?
Рішення санкційні з боку Білого дому, і коли ми чуємо заяви Стіва Віткова, а давайте скасуємо російські санкції, це якраз те про те, що так а чому б і ні?
The logic seems to be that we can't stop the war, but we need to trade. Russia is getting stronger, moving away from China, and someone is convincing Trump that this makes sense. He can come out and say, we've lifted the sanctions because they don't work, Putin is bypassing them, and now everything will be transparent. Russia will receive €1 billion every day for selling coal, oil, and gas, as it did in early 2022, and will use this money to launch missiles at Ukraine, and we will give them a few Patriot systems to fight back. This is exactly what it looks like, and we must realize this. President Zelensky cannot afford to make such statements, but we have to talk about it openly to shape public opinion, particularly in the West, because the voters there need to understand that the Russian threat can affect their country as well. Poland, in my opinion, along with Estonia, are the first in line to be hit if the war in Ukraine ends. This is obvious, and the Poles are already actively preparing for a possible conflict. In Poland, even before the outbreak of hostilities, residents of border villages are being evacuated to build fortifications. There is no war there, but they are already digging trenches. The situation is complicated, but many current politicians still live in the logic of peacetime, which came after the end of the Cold War. For example, Merz was formed in a stable Europe, and perhaps he believes that everything will remain as it was. Orban is the same, has been in politics for a long time, and also believes in the possibility of cooperation with Russia. If you compare the amount of funding the United States allocated to counter the Soviet Union during the Cold War with the amount of money it is currently allocating to support Ukraine, the difference is enormous. Current politicians in the United States and Europe do not fully understand the scale of the threat. The FSB will remain, it will not be destroyed, and this is the key problem. Trump, for example, conducted a successful operation in Iran, but the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has not disappeared.
Бо справді, ви кажете, ФСБ то залишиться, воно нікуди не подінеться, його треба прибрати. От Трамп нібито провів там успішну операцію на території Ірану, але він нікуди квір не подів.
The IRGC is essentially Iran's FSB. They remained in power, and nothing changed. Iran claimed victory, but the threat persists. Though Iran and Russia differ, Iran follows a religious ideology. We must consider such examples. If the West doesn't change its approach, it risks not only failing but also losing Ukraine.
речі, і апелювати до наших європейських партнерів і американських, тому що так ви політику свою не збудуєте, а Україну точно загубите.
Mr. Klochok, thank you for the informative conversation. Our guest was Valeriy Klochok, public figure and chairman of the New Road Charitable Foundation.